My name is Arthur Callahan, and I was 76. The year my daughter moved me into a nursing home she believed belonged to a corporation. It did not belong to a corporation. It belonged to me. She didn't know that. Nobody in my family knew that. That was the point. Catherine said, "You're safer here," on a Wednesday afternoon in October, standing in the doorway of room 14 at Harborview Care and Rehabilitation on Dorchester Avenue in South Boston, her coat still on, her keys in her hand, the posture of a woman completing a task she had scheduled between two other tasks. The room had a window that faced the parking lot, a bed with a blue institutional blanket, a small dresser with a mirror above it that showed me a version of myself I didn't recognize. Smaller than I remembered, older than I felt. "You're safer here, Dad," she said again, as if repetition made it more true. I looked at the parking lot through the window. I had stood in that parking lot 23 years ago, in the rain, with an umbrella that didn't open properly, looking up at this building and deciding whether the numbers worked. They had worked. I bought Harborview Care and Rehabilitation in 2001 through a holding company I had established the previous year. Callahan Property Trust, managed through an LLC registered in Delaware, ownership deliberately obscured behind a management company called Atlantic Elder Care Partners that handled operations and staffing and the day-to-day reality of running a 94-bed skilled nursing facility on Dorchester Avenue. I had purchased 3 such facilities between 1998 and 2004. The other 2 were in Worcester and Providence. I had sold the Worcester property in 2019. Providence was still operating. Harborview was still operating. I had never told my family, not because I was ashamed, because I had learned over 40 years of building things that the people who loved you and the people who knew what you owned were safer kept in separate categories for as long as possible. I should tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. I grew up in Dorchester. My father drove a delivery truck for a linen service. My mother cleaned offices 3 evenings a week and called it her walking around money. We were not poor in the way that makes newspaper stories. We were the specific kind of not poor that required precision, where every dollar had a destination and nothing was wasted and abundance was something that happened to other people. I left Dorchester at 18 on a partial scholarship to UMass Boston. I studied business because it was practical and because I wanted to understand the mechanics of how some people ended up with more and others ended up with less. I worked in commercial insurance for 11 years. Then I started buying properties, small ones first, 3-family buildings in neighborhoods I understood because I had grown up in them, then larger ones, then commercial. Then, in the late 90s, when the healthcare real estate market opened in ways that rewarded people who were willing to do the paperwork carefully, the facilities. Margaret, my wife, had known about some of it, not all. She died in 2018 and left behind a grief I had not known how to prepare for, despite being a man who prepared for everything. After she died, I had simplified where I could and complicated where simplicity felt like erasure. Harborview was complicated. It had been Margaret's idea initially, the concept of owning a care facility. She had watched her own mother spend the last 3 years of her life in a place that smelled like ammonia and indifference, and had said once, quietly at the kitchen table, someone should own these places who actually cares what happens inside them. I had cared. I had tried to build something that didn't smell like indifference, and now my daughter had placed me inside it without knowing it was mine. Catherine was 53. She worked in hospital administration at Mass General, which gave her a vocabulary for care settings and a confidence in using it that occasionally substituted for actual conversation. She was organized, efficient, and loved me in the way certain people love their parents, urgently, from a distance, with decisions made in advance to manage the urgency. Her brother Michael lived in Seattle. He called on birthdays and holidays, and during crises Catherine reported to him, which meant he called when Catherine told him to call. Neither of them knew about Callahan Property Trust. Neither of them knew about Atlantic Elder Care Partners. Neither of them knew that the management company that operated Harborview had been sending quarterly reports to a post office box in Brighton for 23 years that I collected myself on the first Tuesday of every month. Catherine had chosen Harborview because it had good state inspection ratings, because it was 12 minutes from her house in Milton, and because a colleague at Mass General had recommended it. She had chosen it because it was good. I had made it good. That part she didn't know yet. I sat on the edge of the bed with the blue institutional blanket and looked at the parking lot where I had stood in the rain 23 years ago, and I thought about the quarterly report sitting in my post office box in Brighton that nobody had collected in 6 weeks. Then I thought about Patricia Huang. Patricia was the executive director of Harborview. She had worked for Atlantic Elder Care Partners for 14 years. She was 51, precise, and ran the facility with the specific competence of someone who understood that the details nobody noticed were the ones that kept people safe. She also knew exactly who owned the building. She would recognize my name on the intake form. She would come to room 14. And when she did, the conversation my daughter had been avoiding for 3 years was going to become unavoidable. I looked at the parking lot. I almost smiled. Part 2 is where Patricia Huang comes to room 14 and where I'd tell you what I asked her to do. Drop a comment and subscribe. Patricia came at 7:15 the next morning, not during rounds, not as part of a formal intake process. She came the way people come when they've seen something on a form that requires a private conversation before the day gets complicated. I was sitting at the small desk by the window with a cup of coffee the night aide had brought me, reading the Boston Globe on my phone the way I read it every morning, front section first, then business. The knock was 3 times measured. Professional. Come in, I said. She opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind her with the careful quiet of someone managing the sound of a conversation before it started. Patricia Huang was exactly as I remembered from the last facility inspection I had attended in my capacity as a silent owner 18 months ago. Silver-streaked hair pulled back, a cardigan over her scrubs, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The posture of a woman who had been standing at the intersection of care and administration for long enough to understand that both required the same thing, attention. She looked at me. "Mr. Callahan," she said. Her voice was even, not surprised, not alarmed. The voice of a professional who had processed the surprise privately before entering the room. "Patricia," I said. "Sit down, please." She sat in the chair beside the window, the one Catherine had not sat in the day before, because Catherine had kept her coat on and her keys in her hand and her posture in the position of someone passing through. "I saw your name on the intake form yesterday evening," Patricia said. "I want to make sure I understand the situation before I say anything further." "My daughter placed me here," I said. "She doesn't know about the trust or the management company. She chose this facility independently because of the inspection ratings." Patricia nodded slowly. "Does she know you own it?" "No. Are you planning to tell her?" I looked at the parking lot. "Not immediately." Patricia folded her hands in her lap. She had the expression of someone assembling a response that needed to account for several things simultaneously. "Mr. Callahan," she said carefully, "I want to be direct with you. My obligation is to the residents of this facility, including you, now that you're a resident. That obligation doesn't change based on ownership structure." "I know that," I said. "It's one of the reasons I hired you." She acknowledged that with a slight nod. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" "2 things," I said. "First, I want my stay here handled exactly as it would be for any other resident. No special treatment, no adjusted protocols, nothing that would indicate to staff or family that my situation is different from anyone else on this floor." She wrote something in the small notebook she'd brought. "And the second thing, I want you to pull the full facility audit from the last 6 months and bring it to me. Not the summary, the complete documentation. Inspection reports, staffing ratios, incident logs, resident satisfaction surveys." She looked up from the notebook. "Is there something specific you're concerned about?" she asked. "No," I said. "I haven't reviewed the operational detail directly in 14 months. I should have done it sooner. I'm here now." She looked at me for a moment, then she wrote again. "I'll have it to you by this afternoon," she said. "There's one more thing," I said. She waited. "When my daughter comes back, and she will come back on Friday, I don't want you to confirm or deny ownership. If she asks about the facility's ownership structure, tell her it's a matter of public record and she's welcome to research it." Patricia was quiet for 3 seconds. "You want her to find it herself," she said. "I want her to look," I said. "There's a difference." Patricia stood. She straightened her cardigan. She had the expression of a woman who had just been handed an unusual assignment and had already decided to execute it correctly. "I'll have the audit ready by 3, she said. "Thank you, Patricia." She nodded once, opened the door quietly, and was gone. I turned back to the window. The parking lot was filling with the morning shift arriving in coats and scarves against the October cold. 2 aides crossing from the staff lot. A delivery truck backing toward the service entrance. Normal operational. Mine. I picked up my coffee and finished the business section. Part 3 is where the audit shows me something I didn't expect, and where Catherine comes back on Friday. Drop a comment and subscribe. The audit arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. Patricia brought it herself, a manila folder thick enough to require both hands, tabbed and organized with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was the difference between a problem managed and a problem compounded. She set it on the desk beside my coffee cup and left without commentary. That was one of the things I'd always appreciated about Patricia. She understood the difference between information delivery and editorial opinion. I read for 3 hours. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Staffing ratios within compliance thresholds. Inspection reports clean on the major indicators. Resident satisfaction surveys averaging 4.2 out of 5, which for a skilled nursing facility in Massachusetts was genuinely strong. Then I reached the incident logs. 14 months of documented events, flagged, categorized, resolved. Standard entries for a facility this size. Falls, medication discrepancies, family complaints. The ordinary difficulties of caring for people at the most vulnerable point of their lives. But on page 31, something that wasn't ordinary. A notation from 8 months ago. A staffing agency had been contracted to cover 3 overnight shifts per week due to a registered nurse shortage. The agency was called Boston Allied Healthcare Staffing. The contract had been approved by the operations manager, a man named Dennis Ruiz, without going through Atlantic Elder Care Partners for authorization. The contract was for 6 months. It had been renewed twice without documentation reaching my post office box. I pulled the financial summary from the back of the folder. Boston Allied Healthcare Staffing had been paid $187,000 over 14 months. I searched the vendor approval records. Boston Allied had been added to the approved vendor list by Dennis Ruiz 11 months ago. The approval form required 2 management signatures. It had one. I pulled Dennis Ruiz's personnel file from the secondary folder Patricia had included without my asking for it, which told me she had anticipated this specific thread. Dennis Ruiz had been hired as operations manager 19 months ago. His previous employer was listed as Coastal Care Management Group in Providence. I owned the Providence facility. I had not approved Dennis Ruiz's hire at Harborview. That decision had been made at the management company level, below my oversight threshold. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Patricia. She answered on the second ring. Dennis Ruiz, I said. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. I've had concerns for several months, she said. The staffing contract was irregular. I flagged it in the internal log, but the flag didn't generate a response from the management layer above me. Because it didn't reach me, I said. No, sir, it didn't. I need the complete vendor file for Boston Allied Healthcare Staffing, I said. And Dennis Ruiz's authorization records for the past 19 months. Everything. I'll have it to you by morning, she said. I hung up and looked at the parking lot in the dark. $187,000 routed through an irregular contract approved by a single signature from a manager I hadn't hired at a facility I owned, while I was sitting 12 minutes away in my house in Brighton wondering why the quarterly reports had started feeling thinner. Catherine arrived Friday at 11. She knocked twice and came in with a paper bag from a bakery in Milton, the kind of gesture that communicated effort and care, and the specific guilt of a woman who had made a significant decision about someone else's life and was managing her discomfort through pastry. She sat in the chair by the window. She looked around the room with the evaluating eye of someone checking whether the facility was performing to its rating. "How are they treating you?" she said. "Very well," I said. "It's a well-run facility." She nodded. "I thought you'd come around once you settled in." I looked at her. "Catherine," I said, "what do you know about who owns this building?" She blinked. "It's a corporate facility. Atlantic something. Why?" I reached into the folder on my desk and removed a single sheet. The Delaware LLC registration for Callahan Property Trust. My name at the top is managing member. The registration date, 2001. I placed it on the table between us. She looked at it, then at me, then back at the document. The color left her face in one slow total movement. "Dad," she said. "Is this I own the building, Catherine?" I said. "I have owned it for 23 years. The bakery bag sat between us unopened." She stared at the document for a long time. Then she said the only thing she could say. "Why didn't you tell me?" Part 4 is where I answer that question, and where I tell Catherine what I found in the audit. Drop a comment and subscribe. I answered her question the way I answered most questions that mattered. Directly, without softening it into something easier to receive. The people who love you, and the people who know what you own are safer, kept separate for as long as possible, I said. Your grandfather taught me that, not in words. In the way he died with nothing because everyone who loved him knew exactly what he had and helped themselves before he was finished with it. Catherine looked at the document on the table between us. Her hands were flat on her knees, the posture she'd had since she was a child processing something she hadn't expected. "I'm not comparing you to that," I said. "I want to be clear about that." "Then why?" she said. "Because knowledge changes behavior, Catherine. Not always intentionally, not always badly, but it changes it. I wanted you to visit me because you wanted to see me, not because you were managing an asset." She looked at the window, the parking lot. The same view I had been looking at for 4 days. I chose this place, she said quietly. I researched it. I thought I was doing the right thing. You were doing the right thing, I said. The facility has good inspection ratings because I have spent 23 years making sure it does. You chose well. You just didn't know why. She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying. Catherine rarely cried in front of people, a quality she had inherited from me that I had always considered a mixed gift. Then she said, "How long have you been planning to tell me?" "I hadn't planned to tell you at all," I said. "I had planned to die with it in the trust documents and let Gerald Odom explain it to you and Michael. Afterward." "Gerald Odom," she said. "Your attorney. He's been managing the trust since 2001, I said. She absorbed that. "Then how much?" I told her. "Not just Harborview. The full picture. The 3 facilities, the Worcester sale, the Providence property still operating, the trust value as of the last quarterly report." She sat in the chair by the window and listened without interrupting, which was not something Catherine did easily. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, you've been managing this alone since Mom died." "Since before that," I said. "Your mother knew some of it." "How much?" "Enough to understand the structure, not the full detail." Catherine pressed her lips together. "That sounds lonely." "It was precise," I said. "There's a difference." She almost smiled. Then she looked at the manila folder on my desk. "What's that?" she said. I told her about the audit, about Dennis Ruiz, about Boston Allied Healthcare staffing and the $187,000 and the single signature on the vendor approval form. I watched her shift as I spoke. The daughter sitting across from me receded slightly, and the hospital administrator appeared in her place, the woman who spent her professional life reading exactly this kind of operational irregularity. "That's a procurement violation," she said. "At minimum," I said. "And the staffing agency contract renewal without proper authorization, also irregular." She leaned forward. "Do you have the vendor file? Patricia is pulling it this morning." Catherine looked at the folder and then at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her since she was in graduate school and had just been handed a problem worth solving. "I need to see it," she said. "I know," I said. "That's why I told you." She sat back. She looked at the parking lot again. "Dad," she said, "why are you still in this room? You own the building." "Because I'm a resident now," I said. "And Patricia runs a good facility. I intend to let her run it." Catherine shook her head slowly. "The way you shake your head at something that is both absurd and completely consistent with the person you've known your entire life." She picked up the bakery bag and opened it and set a croissant on the desk in front of me. "Tell me everything about Dennis Ruiz," she said. I told her. We spent the next 2 hours going through the audit together, Catherine asking questions and me answering them, the two of us building the same picture from opposite ends of the same information. It was the longest uninterrupted conversation we had shared in 4 years. It was also the most useful. Part 5 is where Dennis Ruiz gets his answer, where Catherine learns what the trust says about her, and where I tell you why I stayed in room 14. Drop a comment and subscribe. Dennis Ruiz resigned on a Tuesday, not voluntarily. Patricia presented him with the complete vendor file, the single signature authorization, the 14 months of payments, and the renewal records that had never reached the management layer above him. She presented it the way Patricia presented everything, quietly, completely, without editorial commentary. Dennis Ruiz looked at the documentation and asked if he could speak with ownership directly. Patricia told him ownership was aware of the situation and had reviewed the file in full. He submitted his resignation in writing before noon. The Boston Allied Healthcare staffing contract was terminated the same day. Gerald Odom referred the financial irregularities to an independent auditor. The full findings would take 6 weeks to compile. I read the resignation letter from room 14 and set it in the folder with everything else. Catherine called Gerald Odom the following week, not because I asked her to, because she was Catherine, and once she understood the structure of something, she needed to understand it completely. Gerald told me afterward that she had asked intelligent questions for 40 minutes and had only raised her voice once, briefly, when he confirmed the trust had been in place since 2001 and that she and Michael were the named beneficiaries. She called me after she hung up with Gerald. "You left us the facilities," she said. "And the Brighton house," I said. "And the investment accounts." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell us we were beneficiaries?" "Because beneficiaries who know they're beneficiaries sometimes start thinking like beneficiaries before the time is right," I said. "I wanted you to build your own lives without calculating mine." Another silence. "That's either very wise or very controlling," she said. "Probably both," I said. She exhaled. "Dad, you put me in a nursing home you own. You put yourself in a nursing home I own," I said. "I simply didn't correct you immediately." She laughed. A real one. The kind I hadn't heard from her in longer than I could remember. I stayed in room 14 for 6 weeks. Not because I had to, because the audit required my presence and because Patricia needed the kind of oversight that worked best from inside the building rather than from a post office box in Brighton. Also because the night aide brought excellent coffee and the morning light through the parking lot window was better than I had expected. Catherine visited every Tuesday and Friday. She stopped keeping her coat on. She started staying for lunch. Michael flew in from Seattle in December. He sat in the chair by the window and looked at the parking lot and said, "So you just own it, just like that." "Since 2001, I said. He shook his head. "You're unbelievable." "I know," I said. "Have some coffee." I moved back to Brighton the week before Christmas. The manger at Harborview, the new one Patricia hired, had strong references and both required signatures on every vendor authorization. Gerald updated the trust documents in January. Catherine and Michael were both briefed completely. Everything was documented, explained, and filed correctly. The quarterly reports still go to the Brighton house now. I collect them myself on the first Tuesday of every month. Some habits don't require changing. They just require the right people finally knowing about them. That's my story. One intake form, one audit, and a building nobody knew I owned. If you've ever built something quietly and waited for the right moment to let it speak, you already know why patience is its own kind of power. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.